I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head. The words were supposed to come out clean, practiced, without any trembling in my voice or weakness in my knees. I had spent weeks preparing for this, the documents folded neatly inside my bag, my signature already a ghost on the pages that needed only his initials to become real. I had even chosen what to wear. A pale blue blouse that made me look composed, professional, like someone who had moved on. Like someone who had not spent the last 8 months crying in a studio apartment so small that the walls felt like they were breathing on her. But no amount of rehearsal prepares you for the smell of a place that once felt like home. The moment the elevator doors parted on the 42nd floor of Sion Tower, that scent reached me. Cool marble, white orchids, and something beneath it all. Something darker and warmer, like cedar and quiet authority. The lobby of Gunwoo's private offices was the kind of place that made ordinary people instinctively lower their voices. The ceilings were absurdly high. The furniture was sparse, but deliberately chosen. Each piece whispering of wealth so settled it no longer needed to announce itself. My arms tightened around the baby carrier strapped to my chest. Hana stirred at the pressure, her tiny fist uncurling against my collarbone. She was 4 months old and already impossibly heavy with meaning, with everything that had led me here. I pressed a kiss to the top of her head, that fine, dark hair, still carrying the milk-sweet scent of newborns, and told myself to breathe. I was only here to sign. The receptionist at the front desk glanced up at me, then at Hana, and something moved briefly across her face before her professional mask slid back into place. She made a call, her voice low and clipped, and gestured for me to take a seat near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Seoul's skyline, like a painting framed in steel and glass. I didn't sit. I couldn't. Instead, I stood with my back to the view and watched the room. I was good at watching. It was one of the few skills my marriage had sharpened in me. When you live beside a man like Gunwoo, you learn to read a room before the room reads you. You notice the weight in people's postures, the direction of their gazes, the particular quality of silence that precedes something significant. The hallway to his inner office stretched ahead of me, and the door at the end was slightly ajar. I told myself not to look. I looked. Through the gap, I could see the edge of his desk, black lacquered wood, immaculate as always, and the long windows behind it, Seoul spread out beyond, like a kingdom he had quietly decided to own. 2 of his men stood just outside the door in the hallway, the way they always stood. Still, hands loose at their sides, eyes moving without appearing to move. I recognized one of them, Young Seo, who had once driven me home from the hospital during a rainstorm without being asked. He saw me now, and gave a barely perceptible nod, the kind that acknowledged everything and revealed nothing. Then the door opened fully. Gunwoo's assistant, a young man in a charcoal suit, stepped out first, holding a tablet, and behind him came a woman I did not recognize. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, deliberate, polished, designed to be looked at. Her dress was deep burgundy silk, and it moved with her like it had been made to move with her specifically. She was laughing at something, her hand raised to touch her collarbone in a gesture of practiced delight. And she was looking back over her shoulder at the person she had just left, at Gunwoo. My lungs forgot their function for exactly 3 seconds. He appeared in the doorway like a piece of architecture. That had always been the truest thing about him. He did not enter spaces so much as complete them. He was wearing a dark navy suit, no tie, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat in that way he reserved for late afternoons, when the formality of the day had already been satisfied. His hair was slightly longer than I remembered. His jaw was exactly as I remembered, precise, unyielding, built for silence. He was 31 years old, and looked like someone who had never once doubted a decision he'd made. The woman in burgundy said something to him, and his expression shifted, not into a smile exactly, but into the shadow of one, private and unguarded. I had not seen that expression in over a year. I had thought somewhere in the quiet devastation of the past 8 months, that perhaps I had imagined it, that I had built something in my memory that had never truly existed. Watching him wear it for someone else made the floor tilt slightly beneath my feet. Hana chose that exact moment to sneeze, small, sharp, unmistakably real. And the sound carried in that high-ceilinged lobby, the way only the smallest sounds can. Gunwoo's gaze moved. It found me the way gravity finds things, without effort, without hesitation, as though the distance between us was simply something that had not yet caught up with physics. The shadow of a smile vanished. For a moment he was completely still, and I knew that stillness. I had catalogued every version of his stillness over 3 years of marriage. This one was the rarest, the one that meant something had happened that he had not planned for, had not predicted, had not controlled in advance. His eyes dropped to the carrier on my chest, to Hana. I watched him understand. The woman in burgundy had turned now, following his gaze, and her expression did something complicated. Curiosity sharpening into something harder at the edges, her eyes moving from Hana to me, to Gunwoo and back again, reading the triangle of us with the particular intelligence of a woman who knows when a room has just shifted against her. I should have said something. I had the words after all. I had rehearsed them for months. I'm here to finalize the divorce. I only need your signature. I don't want anything from you, Gunwoo. I just want this to be over. Instead, what came out of my mouth was nothing. Because Gunwoo had stepped fully into the lobby, and he was walking toward me, and every cell in my body was making the catastrophic mistake of remembering what it had felt like to be the person he walked toward on purpose. He stopped 3 feet away. This close, I could smell cedar and something colder beneath it, clean like winter air. His eyes had not left Hana's face, and the expression on his own face was something I did not have a name for, something that sat between devastation and fury, and a third thing that frightened me more than either of the other two. Amelia, he said. One word. My name, delivered in that low, even register that had once made me feel like the most important thing in any room. I'm here to sign the papers, I said. My voice was steadier than I deserved. He finally looked up at me, and the full weight of his attention after 8 months of nothing was almost physically forceful. I had forgotten, or I had tried to forget, what it cost to be looked at by Gunwoo like that. Like you were a problem he intended to solve personally, and without outside assistance. Who, he said very quietly, is this child? Behind him, the woman in burgundy had gone very still. I squared my shoulders and reminded myself that I had documents in my bag and a plan, and 8 months of hard-won distance that I could not afford to surrender in the next 30 seconds. She's mine, I said. His jaw tightened, the only visible crack in the surface. That's not what I asked. From somewhere deeper in the hallway, one of his men shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, the way they always did when the temperature around Gunwoo changed. I looked at him. This man I had married. This man I had loved with an intensity that had nearly unmade me. This man who had let me walk out of his life without a single word to stop me. And I understood, suddenly and without any comfort, that rehearsing a conversation and surviving it were two entirely different things. Her name is Hana, I said. And then, because I was my mother's daughter, and my mother had never once let a man see her flinch, she's yours. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture and weight, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes the air feel thicker than it should. I watched Gunwoo absorb what I had just said the way I had once watched him absorb bad news from his men, with a complete, deliberate stillness that was more unnerving than any visible reaction could have been. His face revealed nothing, but his hands, hanging loose at his sides, closed slowly into fists and then released, and I knew him well enough to understand that this was the only concession his body would make to the earthquake happening beneath the surface. Behind him, the woman in burgundy had gone from still to rigid. I felt her gaze on the side of my face like a brand, sharp and assessing. but I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Gunwoo, because looking away from him in a moment like this would cost me everything I had left. Hana made a soft sound against my chest, somewhere between a sigh and a question, and I felt Gunwoo's attention drop to her again with the kind of gravity that rearranges rooms. "Inside," he said. Not to me. To everyone. It was a single syllable delivered at a volume that barely qualified as speech, and yet the entire lobby reorganized itself around it. His assistant disappeared. The receptionist found urgent business elsewhere. Youngseo and the other guard moved to flank the hallway without being told. The woman in burgundy, whose name I still did not know, whose presence still sat in my chest like a splinter, took one step forward as though she intended to follow. Gunwoo turned his head toward her, and whatever passed between them in that fraction of a second was wordless and absolute. She stopped. Her expression went through something private and painful before she arranged it back into composure, and then she turned on her heel and walked toward the elevator, with the particular dignity of someone who has been dismissed by an expert. The doors opened for her, as though the building itself was on his payroll. Perhaps it was. "Amelia." He said my name again, and this time it was not a greeting. It was a direction. I followed him into his office because the alternative was standing in that lobby alone, and I was not sure my legs had enough conviction left for stubbornness. The office was exactly as I remembered it, and nothing like it at all. The same black desk, the same windows offering Seoul its daily audience, the same single painting on the wall, an abstract piece in deep grays and muted gold that I had always thought looked like something trying to become something else. But the air was different. Denser, somehow. Or perhaps I was simply smaller than I used to be, and the room knew it. He closed the door behind us. I heard the soft, definitive click of it, and my shoulders tightened involuntarily. Gunwoo did not move to his desk. He stood near the window, and the afternoon light came at him from the side, cutting across the architecture of his face in a way that made him look simultaneously younger and more dangerous than the version I had been carrying in my memory. He looked at Hana with an expression I could not fully decipher. Something raw moving beneath the composed surface, like fire seen through frosted glass. "How old?" he said. 4 months. The math landed between us without any help from either of us. He did it. I could see him doing it, the slight shift in his jaw, the recalculation happening behind his eyes. Whatever conclusions he reached, they settled into his posture like additional weight. "You left," he said, "while you were pregnant." "I didn't know," I said. "Not when I left. I found out after." This was true. It was also insufficient, and we both understood that. He turned to look at me fully then, and the force of it was different from before, less controlled, more unguarded, and therefore, more frightening. Gunwoo's control was the thing that kept the world around him operating at a safe temperature. When it cracked, even slightly, the heat that came through was extraordinary. "And you decided," he said, his voice very low, "to handle this alone." "I decided," I said carefully, "that you had made your priorities clear." Something moved across his face. What does that mean? I thought about the last night we had spent in the same house. The phone call he had taken at 2 a.m, stepping out onto the balcony and speaking in a voice too low to hear through the glass. The way he had looked at me afterward, not with guilt, but with the particular exhaustion of a man managing too many separate worlds. The distance that had been growing between us for months, so gradual I had almost mistaken it for the natural settling of a marriage, rather than its slow erosion. "It means I didn't want to be another obligation on your list," I said. The word obligation did something to his expression that I hadn't expected. A flash of something sharp and almost wounded before the control reasserted itself. "Is that what you thought you were?" It was not a question. It was said in that quiet, dangerous register that his men responded to with immediate deference. But I was not his subordinate, and I had not been for 8 months, and whatever residual fear I might have had of his silences had been burned away by the rather more immediate experience of delivering a baby alone in a hospital in Busan, with no one holding my hand. "I thought," I said, "that you stopped seeing me a long time before I walked out." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the room. Not quickly. Gunwoo never moved quickly. Another of his particular techniques, forcing the world to wait for him rather than the reverse. But he crossed the distance between us with a deliberateness that made my breath shallow, and he stopped close enough that I could see the subtle texture of his suit jacket, close enough that the cedar and cold scent of him became unavoidable. He looked down at Hana. She was awake now, her dark eyes open and unfocused in the way of very young babies, her small fist pressed against her cheek. She was wearing a soft white onesie with tiny bears on it because I had not thought, when dressing her this morning, that she would be meeting her father today. I had not thought she would be meeting her father at all. Not like this. Not in this office. Not with his name on divorce papers sitting in my bag like a verdict. Gunwoo reached out. His hand, large, precise. A hand I had watched sign documents that moved millions. A hand I had watched still rooms full of dangerous men with a single gesture, hovered over Hana's head for a moment, uncertain in a way I had never witnessed from him before. Then his fingers brushed her hair, so gently that I almost didn't feel it through the carrier. Something cracked open in my chest that I did not have the emotional resources to deal with right now. "You should have told me," he said quietly, his eyes still on her face. "You were with someone," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Apparently. His hand stilled. He looked up at me, and the full weight of his attention returned. But different now, stripped of the executive composure, something more elemental beneath it. "That is not what it was. I know what it looked like." His jaw tightened. "And I know that you have been carrying my daughter for 4 months without a word, without asking for anything, without—" He stopped, exhaled once, controlled. "Where have you been living?" The shift from explanation to interrogation was so swift and so characteristically him that I almost laughed. "That's not relevant," I said. "Amelia." The way he said my name had changed again. Lower, more deliberate, threaded through with something that sounded uncomfortably like the beginning of a decision I hadn't been consulted about. "Where have you been living?" "I have an apartment. We're fine. I didn't come here for—" "You came here," he said, "to hand me a piece of paper and disappear again." The accuracy of it silenced me for a moment. He took the silence as confirmation, and something resolved in his expression, settled into that particular stillness that I recognized as the moment Gunwoo stopped considering options and began executing the one he had already chosen. "That," he said quietly, "is not going to happen. I had made a mistake coming here in person. I understood that now with the clarity that only arrives too late, when the situation has already closed around you like a hand. I should have sent the documents through a lawyer. That had been the original plan, in fact, before my lawyer informed me that Gunwoo's legal team had quietly ensured that any unilateral filing would require his physical acknowledgement. A technicality, she had called it. A deliberate construction, I had understood it to be. Even then, 8 months ago, he had been building walls I hadn't noticed. "Gunwoo," I said, keeping my voice measured, maternal, entirely in control of a situation that was visibly escaping me. "I'm not asking for anything. I have a stable apartment. I have work. Hana is healthy. All I need is your signature." He looked at me for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has heard something so fundamentally contrary to his intentions that he is deciding whether to address it directly or simply proceed as though it had not been said. He proceeded as though it had not been said. "Jung-seo." He said the name at a volume that should not have carried through a closed door. The door opened anyway. "Have Mrs. Han prepare the East Suite, and call Dr. Yoon." I want a pediatrician here within the hour. Gunwoo, I started. You've been traveling, he said, turning back to me with the particular calm of someone who has already won an argument the other person doesn't yet know they're having. Hana needs to be checked. You both need to eat. We can discuss the rest after. We are not discussing anything after. I told you I'm only here to hand me papers. His eyes met mine. I heard you. Then, I also heard, he said quietly, that my daughter has been alive for 4 months, and I did not know her name until 11 minutes ago. The words landed without dramatics, without any raise in his voice, and they were somehow more devastating for it. I felt them settle into the space between my ribs, like something cold finding warmth. I wanted to argue. I had arguments, good ones, carefully constructed over 8 months of solitary nights and long walks along the Busan waterfront with Hana strapped to my chest, rehearsing all the things I would say if I ever had to say them. I had architecture built from his absences, from the growing silences, from the woman in burgundy and whatever she represented. I had evidence and precedent, and a very thorough understanding of why leaving had been the only rational choice. But Gunwoo was looking at Hana again with that expression I didn't have a name for, and the arguments dissolved before I could reach them. 1 hour, I said finally. The pediatrician, and then we talk. And talking does not mean you've decided anything. Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. Closer to the expression of a man who has just confirmed a hypothesis he'd hoped was correct. 1 hour, he agreed. The East Suite was not what I had expected, though I was not sure what I had expected. Perhaps a guest room, spare, functional, the kind of space that communicates polite indifference. Instead, it was a room that occupied an entire corner of the tower's residential floor, with windows on 2 sides offering the city in panoramic generosity. The furniture was pale wood and cream linen, warm without being excessive. Someone had placed white flowers on the dresser, not orchids this time, but something smaller and softer, the kind that don't announce themselves. A woman named Mrs. Han, silver-haired and efficient with the particular warmth of someone who has spent decades making impossible situations comfortable, had appeared with a portable crib assembled from what seemed like nowhere and a selection of baby supplies still in their packaging. We keep a full household stock, she said, anticipating my expression. Mr. Jang is thorough. He always had been. Thorough was perhaps the most dangerous of his qualities. I settled Hana into the crib and stood with my arms crossed watching her sleep, acutely aware of the city below and the door behind me and the specific quality of safety that this building offered. The kind that comes with conditions I hadn't agreed to yet. Dr. Yoon arrived in 40 minutes, a composed woman in her 50s who examined Hana with practiced gentleness and declared her healthy with the kind of brisk certainty that expensive doctors deliver as standard. She asked me routine questions about feeding and sleep and development, and I answered them competently, and she looked at me once with the carefully neutral expression of someone who is professionally uninvested in whatever family drama has generated her house call. Gunwoo stood in the doorway for the entirety of the examination. He did not come in. He did not ask questions. He simply stood there, still, watching, his arms loose at his sides, with the focused attention of a man memorizing something he intends to protect. I felt his presence the way you feel a window left open in winter, a constant, specific awareness at the edge of everything else. After Dr. Yoon left, Mrs. Han brought food, soup, rice, small dishes of vegetables, all of it warm and precise in the way that only food made with genuine attention can be. She set it on the low table near the window and withdrew with the discretion of long practice. I should not have been hungry. I was ravenous. I sat cross-legged on the floor beside the table. The chair felt too formal, too poised, and I was done performing composure for one afternoon, and ate with the singular focus of someone who had been running on coffee and determination since 6 that morning. Gunwoo came in and sat across from me, not at the table, on the floor like I was. He removed his jacket first, folded it with automatic precision and set it aside, and then sat with his back against the base of the couch in a posture that was almost casual, almost human, and I recognized it because I had seen it before in the early years of our marriage, those rare evenings when the armor came off, and he was simply a man in a room with a woman he trusted. The recognition of it hurt in a place I hadn't expected. We ate in silence for a while. Outside, Seoul was beginning its evening transition, lights surfacing in windows across the skyline like slow waking stars. "The woman," I said finally, because leaving it unaddressed was its own kind of wound. "In the burgundy dress." He set down his chopsticks. "Her name is Soo-yeon. She is the daughter of a business associate." A pause. "She has been attempting to position herself as more relevant to my life than she is. She looked very comfortable in your office." "She was in my office for 20 minutes regarding a contract her father wanted reviewed." His voice was even, but something beneath it was tight. "I am aware of how it appeared. I am also aware that I do not owe you." He stopped. Something shifted in his jaw. "I was going to say that I don't owe you explanations, which is technically true. But," I said carefully. "But," he said, "technical truths are a poor substitute for actual ones." I looked at him across the low table, this man who had built an empire on precision and control and the careful management of what others knew about him, and I tried to locate the version of him I had married beneath the version sitting in front of me now. They were the same person. That was the problem. "You let me leave," I said. He held my gaze. "I know. You didn't call. You didn't send anyone. For 8 months, Gunwoo." "I know." His voice was very quiet. "Why?" The word fell between us with more weight than its single syllable should have carried. I had asked it in 100 imaginary conversations over 8 months. I had constructed his answers and argued against them and arrived at conclusions and discarded them. But I had never actually asked him, and the silence that preceded his real answer was different from anything I had rehearsed. "Because you left," he said. "And I thought it was what you wanted." He looked at his hands for a moment, an uncharacteristically uncertain gesture. "I thought staying away was the only thing I could give you that you actually needed." "That's not..." I stopped, started again. "You could have asked." "Could I?" He looked up. "When was the last time you told me what you needed, Amelia? When was the last time you didn't simply disappear into silence and expect me to follow you through it?" The fairness of it struck me somewhere undefended. I opened my mouth and found nothing immediately available. From the crib, Hana made a small sound. Not distress, just presence. The unconscious assertion of a sleeping baby, reminding the room that she existed. We both looked at her. "I have a lot of security around this building," Gunwoo said, after a moment. His voice had changed again, quieter, but with a new edge beneath it, the kind that meant he was transitioning from conversation to something more structural. "The neighborhood you described..." "I didn't describe my neighborhood." "The postal code on your lawyer's correspondence," he said, without any particular emphasis. "Busan. Sasang District." I stared at him. "You looked up my postal code." "I looked up everything I was legally entitled to know," he said, meeting my eyes with complete calm. "Which was very little, because you were careful. But Sasang is an industrial district, Amelia. It is not..." "It's perfectly safe," I said, heat rising in my voice. "We have everything we need. You have a 4-month-old daughter and an apartment in a district I would not allow my lowest-level associate to house his family in." The quietness of his voice did not soften the words at all. "That changes tonight. You don't get to decide." "I understand," he said, with the infuriating patience of a man who has already made up his mind, "that you believe that." I did not stay because he told me to. I want to be clear about that. Not for his benefit, but for my own, because the distinction mattered to me in a way that was difficult to articulate, and easy to lose track of when Gunwoo was in the same room. I stayed because Hana had fallen into the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had managed in weeks, her small chest rising and falling with the contentment of a baby who had somehow sensed that the building around her was impenetrable, and I could not bring myself to lift her out of that crib and carry her back into the cold of an evening I hadn't planned for. That was the reason. I repeated it to myself several times as Mrs. Han appeared with fresh towels and a set of clothes that fit me with suspicious precision. A soft gray sweater, dark trousers, the kind of quality that announces itself only in the way fabric falls. I did not ask how she had known my size. In Gunwoo's world, such details were simply managed, the machinery of his careful control running so smoothly it became invisible. I slept poorly, which was not unusual. Hana woke twice, and I fed her in the blue dark of the suite with the city glowing 40 floors below, and I thought about exits and documents, and the particular stubbornness required to leave the same person twice. Morning arrived gray and determined, the kind of soul autumn morning that smells of rain that hasn't fallen yet. I found Gunwoo in the kitchen adjacent to the residential floor. Not his office, not a formal dining room, but an actual kitchen, the kind of space that suggested someone occasionally lived here, rather than simply occupied the building. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, already dressed, already composed, the day apparently having offered him no difficulty whatsoever. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway with Hana against my shoulder. Something moved in his face. Quick, unguarded, the expression of a man caught wanting something before his control could arrange a more measured response. He set down his cup and crossed the kitchen without apparent decision, and I had just enough time to recognize what was happening before his hands were gentle on Hana's back, not taking her, simply present, his palms spread warm and careful across her tiny spine. "Good morning," he said. To her. He said it to her, in a voice I had never heard him use before. Lower, softer, stripped of every layer of authority. Something in my chest performed an act of structural compromise that I immediately attempted to reverse. "I need to go back to Busan today," I said. "I have work tomorrow, and Hana's things are—" "I've arranged for your things to be collected," he said, still looking at Hana. I stared at him. "You've arranged—" "Mrs. Han has the address. A team went last night." He looked up now, reading my expression with the accuracy he always brought to situations he knew would require management. "Your belongings are in transit. They'll arrive by noon." The audacity of it was so complete that it temporarily evacuated language from my brain. Gunwoo. I said his name the way you say the name of someone who has just done something that defies immediate categorization. You cannot simply, "My apartment, my lease, has been handled." He returned to the counter and poured a second cup of coffee, set it at the place nearest me, with the calm of a man performing a normal domestic act. "You were month to month. The landlord was compensated generously. That was my home. It was 400 square feet in Sasong with a heating system that failed twice last winter." He looked at me steadily. "I read the maintenance reports. How did you—" I stopped, breathed. "You've been watching my apartment." "I've been aware of your situation," he said, with a distinction that was technically meaningful and practically enraging. "There is a difference." "There is no difference. Gunwoo, you had no right. She is my daughter." The quietness of his voice did not diminish the absolute weight of it. "Whatever rights I forfeited regarding you, I did not forfeit them regarding her. I would have been watching over her from the moment I knew she existed." His jaw tightened slightly. "You ensured I didn't know, so I made do with what I had." The logic of it was infuriating specifically because it was not entirely without foundation, and I hated the part of me that recognized this. I picked up the coffee because my hands needed something to do, and because refusing it felt like a childish gesture, and I stood at the window with my back partly to him, and looked at Seoul assembling itself in the gray morning light. "This isn't a solution," I said. "Me being here. It's not. We are still not married, Gunwoo. Those papers exist regardless of where my furniture is. I know, he said. Then you understand that this... I gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the suite, the building, all of it. This is not sustainable. I understand that you believe that, he said, which was exactly what he had said last night, and I recognized it now as a pattern. His way of acknowledging my position while simultaneously declining to be governed by it. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and the domestic version of him receded slightly, the executive layer resurfacing with the automatic efficiency of long practice. He spoke briefly in Korean, too low and too fast for me to follow beyond fragments. And whatever the response was, it settled into his posture as a problem he would address and manage and resolve, the way he addressed and managed and resolved everything. He ended the call and looked at me. I have meetings this morning. Young-seo will be outside the door. Mrs. Han is available for anything you need. A pause. I'll be back by early afternoon. I'm not a guest to be managed while you work, I said. No, he agreed. You're not. He picked up his jacket from the chair, shrugged into it with the smooth economy of movement that was so characteristically him. You're the mother of my child, staying in my home, and I would like you to be comfortable while I ensure that no one who has reason to want leverage over me knows you're here. I blinked. What does that mean? He paused at the kitchen doorway, and something shifted in his expression. A fraction of something real beneath the management. The briefest visibility of the weight he carried so constantly that he had stopped noticing it as weight. It means, he said carefully, that my world has edges, Amelia. You knew that when we married. The difference now is that Hana exists, and the edges of my world become relevant to her in ways they were not before. He left before I could answer, and the room felt different in his absence. Not empty exactly, but reconfigured, the way spaces do when a significant gravitational presence withdraws. I stood with my coffee and thought about edges. 3 days passed in a rhythm I had not chosen and could not entirely resist. Gunwoo was absent for large portions of each day. Meetings, calls, the invisible architecture of his operations moving around him like weather. But he was present in the mornings with that unguarded quality that the kitchen seemed to bring out in him, and in the evenings he came back earlier than I expected, shedding the executive composure in increments as the hours passed. He learned Hana with the focused intentionality he brought to everything he deemed important. He watched how I held her, how I positioned her during feeding, the particular rhythm of patting that settled her when she fussed. On the second evening, he asked if he could hold her, framing it as a question with such uncharacteristic tentativeness that I almost didn't recognize the register. I placed Hana in his arms and watched him recalibrate, the immediate adjustment of his posture, the instinctive lowering of his center of gravity, the way his entire bearing shifted from contained authority to something closer to reverence. Hana looked up at him with the ancient, unfocused wisdom of very young infants, and Gunwoo looked back at her with an expression that dismantled something in me I had been carefully reinforcing for months. On the third morning, I came into the kitchen to find him on the phone, Hana cradled in one arm with a confidence that had not been there 2 days ago, his free hand holding documents he was apparently reviewing simultaneously. He was speaking in a measured, authoritative voice that filled the room, but his arm around Hana was unhurried, the hold of someone who had already decided this was permanent. He saw me watching and said something brief into the phone before lowering it. She woke early, he said. I heard her on the monitor. I thought you might need the sleep. I had not given him access to the monitor. I looked at the small device on the counter and understood that he had simply acquired one and connected it without announcing the fact, because that was how Gunwoo operated. Quietly, thoroughly, without requesting permission for things he had already decided were necessary. You can't just... I started. You've slept 4 hours in 3 days, he said. I counted. The fact that he had been counting the hours of my sleep was alarming, and tender in equal measure, and I did not know what to do with the combination. Gunwoo, we need to talk about the papers. We do, he agreed without any evasion. Tonight. Over dinner. Properly. He said it with the confidence of a man scheduling a meeting he fully intends to control the outcome of, and I told myself that I was prepared for that conversation, that 8 months of distance had given me sufficient armor for whatever tonight would bring. I was not prepared. I know that now. What I did not yet know. Standing in that kitchen watching the man I had married hold our daughter with the quiet certainty of someone who had made an irreversible decision, was that the conversation scheduled for dinner would not be the most significant thing that happened that day. That distinction belonged to the visitors who arrived at 4 p.m. 2 men in expensive suits who were shown into Gunwoo's private meeting room by a pale-faced assistant, and whose arrival caused Jungseo to appear at my door within minutes, with a request delivered in the careful, diplomatic language of someone conveying an order softened into a suggestion. Mr. Yang would like you and the baby to remain in the suite this afternoon. With the door locked, if you don't mind. I minded enormously. But I looked at Jungseo's face, and at the particular stillness that had settled over the residential floor like a held breath. And I locked the door. The locked door lasted 40 minutes before I heard raised voices. Not Gunwoo's. His voice was never the one you heard. It was the other men, the visitors in expensive suits, and their anger was audible even through walls designed to absorb exactly this kind of sound. I sat on the edge of the bed with Hana in my arms and listened to the muffled architecture of a confrontation I couldn't parse, my pulse measuring time in uneven increments. Then silence. The particular silence of something concluded. 10 minutes later, Gunwoo knocked twice on the suite door. His knock, the one I recognized from 3 years of marriage, 2 deliberate beats with his knuckle. And I opened it to find him standing in the hallway with his jacket still perfectly placed, and his expression arranged into composure so complete it was itself a kind of communication. "They're gone," he said. "Who were they?" He looked at me for a moment with the assessment of a man deciding how much of one world to allow into another. Then he stepped inside and closed the door. And he sat on the low chair near the window with his forearms on his knees. A posture of genuine tiredness that he would never have displayed in front of anyone he needed to manage. He displayed it in front of me, and I understood that this was its own kind of statement. "Associates of a man named Bayek," he said. "He and I have had a disagreement of long standing regarding certain business territories. He has recently become aware that I have..." A pause, careful. A personal vulnerability that did not previously exist. The words settled over me slowly, and their meaning arrived with a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "They know about Hana," I said. "They know I have a child." His eyes met mine. "They don't know where you are. They came today to confirm whether the information they'd received was accurate, and to measure my response." He was quiet for a moment. I gave them a response. I did not ask what form that response had taken. Some knowledge exists at a threshold you choose not to cross, and I had always understood, even in the ordinary feeling years of our marriage, that Gunwoo's world had rooms I was not equipped to enter. "How serious is this?" I said. "Manageable," he said, which in Gunwoo's vocabulary meant serious enough to require immediate management. "But it changes the timeline of certain things." I looked at him across the room. This man who had once been the safest place I knew, who had become a distance I couldn't cross, who was now sitting in the gray afternoon light, looking tired in a way he would show no one else. And I felt the last of my carefully constructed arguments begin to lose their structural integrity. "The divorce papers," I said. He held my gaze. "Yes. You're going to tell me that signing them right now creates a vulnerability." "I'm going to tell you," he said quietly, "that signing them right now is the last thing I want to do. The security consideration is real, but it is not the primary reason." He leaned forward slightly, and the tiredness in his face gave way to something unguarded and direct, the expression of a man who has reached the boundary of his own management capacity and decided to simply speak. "I made mistakes, Amelia. Significant ones. I let the distance grow because I told myself you needed space, when the truth was that I didn't know how to cross it, without dismantling the version of myself that kept everything around you safe. His jaw tightened. That was a failure. Mine, not yours. The room was very quiet. Hana was warm and heavy against my chest, her breathing the slow, even rhythm of a child who trusts the world holding her completely. Outside, Seoul moved through its afternoon with indifference to everything happening in this room. "You let me walk out," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "I know." He held my gaze without deflection. Every day for 8 months I picked up the phone and put it down. I told myself you were safer without the visibility my attention would bring. I told myself distance was protection. Something moved across his face, honest and almost painful. I was protecting myself from having to admit that I didn't know how to be what you needed, while also being what my world required. That was cowardice, dressed up as strategy. I had not expected the word cowardice from him. In 3 years of marriage, I had never heard Gunwoo apply it to himself, had never witnessed him hold his own actions up to that particular light. The unexpectedness of it undid more than any argument could have. "I named her after your grandmother," I said. Something shifted in his face with a completeness I had never witnessed from him before. Not the controlled adjustments, not the managed transitions between states, but an actual fracture in the surface, brief and total. His grandmother, who had died the year before we married, whose name he had spoken to me exactly once, late at night, on a balcony in Jeju, with the sea below us and his guard entirely down. Hana. Her name had been Hana. He was quiet for a long moment, and in the quiet, I watched him reassemble himself with the particular deliberateness of a man handling something fragile. "Why?" he said finally. His voice was not entirely steady. "Because she deserved to be named after someone real," I said. "Someone who mattered to the person who made her." He stood and crossed the room, and he did the thing he had never done in the lobby 3 days ago when every instinct had clearly directed him toward it. He pulled me against him, carefully, with Hana between us, his arms around both of us with the controlled desperation of someone who has been holding himself away from something for so long that the return of it requires extreme management. I let him. I let him because 8 months of solitary conviction is a long time, and because Hana's name had been a message I hadn't admitted I was sending until the moment he received it, and because the cedar and cold scent of him was, catastrophically, still the thing my body identified as safety. We stood like that for a long time without speaking. The divorce papers were never signed. Not that day. Not in the weeks that followed. Not in the quiet reconstruction of something that had to be built differently than it had been the first time. With more honesty, more deliberate crossing of distances, more of the conversations we had both been too defended to have during the years when everything appeared to be functioning. It was not simple. I want to be honest about that, because the story of Gunwoo and me was never a simple one, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to every difficult morning and every hard conversation and every moment when I had to consciously choose to trust him again with the part of me that his world had always carried a risk of damaging. He restructured things, not everything. I understood, finally and completely, that his world was what it was, that the edges would always exist, that Young-seo would always be somewhere nearby, and that some questions had answers I was not meant to know. But he drew a clearer line between that world and the one where Hana learned to roll over on the living room floor of the apartment we moved into together, where he came home earlier than his schedule technically permitted because there were things he refused to miss. Beck's people did not return. Whatever Gunwoo had communicated in that meeting room was apparently sufficient. I did not ask for details. I accepted the protection the way you accept weather, acknowledging it, adapting to it, finding within its constraints a life that was genuinely mine. Soo-yeon appeared once more, briefly, at a formal event I attended as Gunwoo's wife. Because we remarried quietly, in the presence of Mrs. Han and Young-seo and no one else. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, with Hana in a white dress falling asleep against my shoulder during the vows. Soo-yeon looked at me across the room, with an expression that contained the full complexity of a woman understanding that a story she had briefly featured in had already ended, and then she turned away, and I did not see her again. Gunwoo noticed. He always noticed. His hand found the small of my back with a pressure that was both reassurance and the specific, restrained possessiveness that had always been part of who he was. The part I had once found suffocating, and which I had come to understand, was simply how he loved, quietly and completely, and with a thoroughness that left no room for doubt. "She's leaving," he said, close to my ear. "I know," I said. "Good." His hand stayed where it was. I thought about the woman I had been 11 months ago, walking into his lobby with folded papers and a baby strapped to my chest, and a prepared speech dissolving on my tongue. I thought about the apartment in Sasong, the 400 square feet, the broken heating and the long nights and the particular loneliness of loving someone you have decided to stop loving. I thought about a name chosen late at night in Busan, in the blue dark, with a sleeping baby and a feeling I hadn't admitted was hope. Hana looked up at me now from the crook of Gunwoo's arm across the room, her face round and bright with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had learned that when she reached for something, hands were there to receive her. She had his jaw and my eyes and something entirely her own in the way she looked at the world, direct, curious, entirely unafraid. I had arrived for a divorce. I had stayed for the truth, which was that the distance between Gunwoo and me had never been the clean break I had tried to make it. It had always been a held breath, a paused sentence, a question neither of us had been ready to answer until the morning she sneezed in a marble lobby and reminded us both that some things, once begun, insist on their own completion. He caught me looking and held my gaze across the room with the quiet, absolute attention that had once made me feel like the most important thing in any space. It still did. The difference was that now I believed it.